Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the leadership team here at America at a Crossroads. This is a project of Jews United for Democracy and Justice. Along with me are former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, and we're all three very pleased to be able to bring you these programs each week. We work hard to make sure we have the very best speakers, and that is no exception for tonight. Welcome and many thanks to our guest, EJ Dionne, and to our wonderful moderator, Madeleine Brand. We are grateful that you are here tonight with our America at a Crossroads audience to discuss how progressives and moderates can unite to save our country. That's the subtitle of EJ's new book called Code Red. I actually like the subtitle because it actually feels hopeful, and that's what I'm hoping we get tonight, a little measure of hope in a sort of difficult time for most of our audience. Just to remind you, anyone can watch any of our weekly programs after the fact. We have over 300 programs that we have presented over the last 5 or 6 years. You can watch them on our YouTube station, which is America at a Crossroads, or at our website, which is JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. And you can also listen to all of our programs via podcast starting the morning after the program. Next week on July 16th, we are very pleased to present, he hasn't been with us for about a year, but we've had him many times on our program, Max Boot with the Washington Post, in a conversation with Warren Olney. And the title is Russia's War on Ukraine, Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and the Search for Peace. And we haven't had an update on the Ukraine for a while. I know we're overdue, and next week will be a great opportunity to learn from a really smart analyst what's going on. Without any further ado, please welcome the wonderful Madeleine Brand. Madeleine is an extraordinary broadcast journalist with many awards and accolades to her name. She has taught broadcast journalism at Columbia University School of Journalism, and she created and hosts Press Play, the award-winning daily news and culture show on our local NPR affiliate in Southern California called KCRW. On the show, she covers national, international, and local stories through the unique lens of Southern California. So Madeleine, the show is all yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back, Janice, and it's great to have EJ with us for the entire hour because I have been reading him and listening to him for many decades. And for people who don't know, he has been a trusted political analyst for many decades. He's a senior fellow at the W. Averell Harriman Chair in American Governance in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. He's obviously a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, also teaches at Georgetown University. He's written more than half a dozen books, the latest of which is the one that Janice mentioned, and here it is, Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. EJ, welcome.
Be with you. It's a real honor to be with you, and you've done such extraordinary work over the years, but also with this amazing group of people that includes so many who've dedicated themselves to public life, public service, and social justice. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much. And I felt like we could do a kind of almost a hymn, Let Freedom Ring from Avon, Connecticut to Victoria, Texas to La Jolla. But anyway, it was great. I loved hearing the roll call.
Too.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive right in and talk about the big political news, and that is, of course, the big, beautiful, whatever it is, the law, I guess now, and I don't know what the actual title of it is now, but it was renamed. Anyway, despite its unpopularity, seemingly on both sides of the aisle, it was signed into law on July 4th, rushed into law on July 4th, all 900 plus pages of it. And I'm wondering, first of all, what you made of the swift capitulation of many Republicans who were very adamant that they did not like this bill and yet voted for it. What does that say to you?
Aside the specifics, which I think were terrible, and we can talk about those, I think one of the worst things about this episode is that it showed that the content of the bill didn't matter in the least, and that the Republican Party at this moment, with a handful of exceptions, is committed to Donald Trump. And if Medicaid cuts were in the bill, they'd vote for it. If they weren't in the bill, they'd vote for it. Deficit hawks, so-called, said, this is a terrible bill. I'll never vote for it. I'll never vote for it. They voted yes. A more middle of the road conservatives who may have objected to these deep Medicaid cuts and cuts in hunger programs, food stamps, said, oh, we can't vote for that. They voted for it. And so I think it's a terrible sign of how much the Republican Party has turned itself into the Donald Trump party. And the content is extraordinary because what you've done is I can't think of a bill, and I think there is no example of a bill that was, number one, as regressive as this bill was. It raises incomes massively at the very top, and actually will cut the income of people in the bottom 20%, 10%, depending on how you want to count it, do very little for the middle. But also, you cut over $1 trillion out of programs that people actually need and use. Many of them, by the way, Republican Trump voters. You cut all this, and you still add, depending on how you want to count, $3 to $5 trillion to the deficit. It's hard to think of a worse idea than this bill, but the Republicans were ready to vote for whatever Trump asked them to. And Trump himself, I think, was fairly indifferent to the content. He said he'd never cut Medicaid, and here are these Medicaid cuts. And there are a lot of other problems like that.
Right. And so it would have taken literally in the Senate one vote to tank this, which would be Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. And she had grave misgivings and got some special favors for her state granted to her. And she even said, as she was voting for it, this is bad for the rest of the country. So what I'm wondering is why she and a handful of others don't band together, Rand Paul, Collins, Tillis. Tillis is retiring, but in general, they could stop a lot of this legislation if just a few of them banded together. So why is it that they don't do that?
I think the real contrast, you're right, of course, and the real contrast is with the Affordable Care Act. Now, granted, the margins were slimmer even in that case, but Collins and Murkowski stuck together against repeal, and then John McCain very famously cast that very dramatic vote, saying the thumbs down vote, and it didn't happen. I think a couple of things are different. One is that in the case of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, it was 100% clear to a lot of people across the country what the repeal of that would mean, because it was a total repeal and they replaced it with an utterly inadequate system. I think in this case, they went at it in a way piecemeal, which is they will do a lot of damage to Medicaid. They will do a lot of damage to rural hospitals, but they were able to say that, this is not really a Medicaid cut. This is, work requirements and the like, which will drive a lot of people off. People who say they hate bureaucracy and paperwork created a special bureaucracy and paperwork for the least advantaged people in the country with these work requirements. But it also says something about the nature of Trump's control over the Republican Party, which I think is stronger now. And the fear of Trump is stronger now. And Trump has given a lot of examples to Republicans of that if they cross him, he will beat them in primaries. And right now, the Republican primary electorate is, broadly speaking, a Trump electorate. And, the tragic thing was that Tom Tillis felt totally comfortable in doing what he did after he announced he was not running for re-election. And that really sort of symbolizes, I think, what's happened inside the Republican Party right now.
But I wonder if there's also something more sinister in something that Murkowski alluded to when she said earlier that she was afraid. And it wasn't clear what she was afraid of, either of being primaried or of actual political violence, because we saw, of course, those tragic assassinations in Minnesota and a list of others who, may have also met that fate. And Trump himself has been the subject of 2 assassination attempts. And do you think that's also playing into it, that there's actual genuine fear that if they go against Trump, they may be the subject of some actual real physical violence?
There is no question, and scholars who study political violence talk about how there is an extraordinary increase in the number of threats, plausible threats against public officials. And so I do think, and Murkowski, when she made that statement, specifically spoke about fear. And I think it was a fear that went beyond political fear. Beyond in this bill, to me, one of the scariest things, I mean, the Medicaid and snap cuts are outrageous from a social justice point of view. The scariest thing is this massive increase in spending on ICE, which will turn ICE into, by some measures, the largest law enforcement institution in the country. And you will have a new system of law enforcement, this national police force, created under Trump, with this administration picking who joins this police force as it grows. And I think that's very alarming. And, I don't think it's just, people who are paranoid about Trump who are saying this. My colleague, Catherine Rampell, is a very sensible person, wrote about this in the Washington Post, about the danger of this. Ed Luce, a great correspondent for the Financial Times, wrote about this. This is very scary. I think that one of the central elements of this bill is this massive expansion of ICE, which I think is, it's obviously a threat to immigrants, but given that people are being rounded up who in many cases are legally here, who did not commit crime, this is a threat to, at some level, everyone. And so, I think fear is real, and it's not just paranoia.
Right. And there was a story today, which I confess I haven't read yet because it crossed just a couple of hours ago, about the federal government investigating, or at least looking into, Comey, the former FBI director. And
right, he did that sort of 86-47 or something on the beach, and immediately the right wing said that's a threat to kill Trump. And right away, the Secret Service started tracking his phone, followed his car, and it was, he had already called in and said, that wasn't a threat. I'm against violence. And he had a conversation with the Secret Service, and, they did that anyway. And I do think, there is a lot of intimidation going on with the administration.
So, as you mentioned, there's this massive increase in the funding for ICE. And I just want to throw out a couple of numbers. ICE, from what I understand, is now funded between $8 and $11 billion, and that's going to go up substantially. There's 30 billion more for operations and 45 billion for detention. And as you say, it's the highest funding for any federal law enforcement agency, I think, in the history of the United States. It's bigger than some countries' militaries, including Israel's. So when you have $45 billion to build private prisons, and what does that say to you? And how alarmed are you, and how alarmed should we be that this is happening? Because once you build these prisons, there will be a push to fill them.
It's a very curious thing that Trump promised all of these roundups of people who broke the law, people who were killers, who committed robberies, and, to say these are the people we're going to deport. And one of the striking things is how unsuccessful they have actually been at rounding up the kind of people they said they promised they would round up. And Stephen Miller in the White House, as news reports suggested, was really angry at ICE, at the people carrying this out, that they weren't meeting, as it were, the quotas set of people to round up, and that has increased sort of willy-nilly roundups you guys have seen out in California. And so all of that is very worrying. But if I could step back for a sec, I am very worried about a slow deterioration of the rule of law that's concentrating power in the White House. Almost nobody talks about it anymore, but And everybody remembers that Congress passed a law that was upheld by the Supreme Court that would have forced the immediate sale of TikTok. And then Trump developed a relationship with some people at TikTok. There seemed some campaign contributions. And Trump said, don't worry. He set aside a law in the country unilaterally. And I think that was the beginning of something you're seeing that you've seen ever since, this aggrandizement of power in one person. The Supreme Court just upheld these mass firings that were done. The USAID was destroyed, not by act of Congress that created it, but by Elon Musk and the administration, the Voice of America, which, many people on the conservative side over many years were real supporters of the Voice of America as a force for democracy in the world, an opponent of oppression. That was just wiped out. And you can go down a long list of things, the canceling of all sorts of scientific research. This is all done without Congress acting at all. And so, there is the specific threat of ICE and the force there, but there is this larger, slow and steady deterioration of checks on presidential power. And the Supreme Court, as the economists pointed out recently, has ruled in favor of the president on all these things. And if I remember the number right, it was 12 out of the 15 cases that had come up until the time they came out. And you have, God love her, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, really, dissenting in an extraordinary way, because I think she is rightly very afraid of what this capitulation means. So if I could add one thing, forgive me, that was a long answer, but a friend of mine many years ago accused me of being a feliciopath. I tend to be a hopeful person who will see something hopeful no matter how bad the situation is. And so I do have a kind of default to hope, and I still, a long run, have hope for our country. But this has really tested even a feliciopath like me, this period. I find this, I was obviously unhappy during the first 6 months of Trump's first presidency, but I find this much more alarming, much more aggressive, and I think deeply worrying.
So you wrote this book during the end of the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
How much of it is still, or is there anything in here, if you could go back and rewrite it, you would?
I think I might write another book. I broadly agree with the argument I made in this book and think that it is very much relevant to now. I did write, by the way, for those interested, I wrote with my friend Miles Rappaport a subsequent book back in my latest book in 2022 is called 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting, where we argue that the U.S. needs to adopt the Australian system of requiring everybody to vote. And I'm happy to talk about that another time. But my commitment is deeply to democracy itself. And here's a line I'll just read from the book. I looked it up before we went on. At this moment, especially, what moderates and progressives share is more important than what they might disagree on. A deep belief in democracy and freedom, a commitment to public problem solving, a frustration, and now I would add alarm over the collapse of norms, and of now I would say constitutional restraints that promote basic decency. And they're united as well by a desire for a fairer economy that allows all citizens to live in dignity and hope. And the Democrats basically followed this idea of a broad coalition, that middle of the road people needed to come together with progressives and vice versa. You saw that in the 2018 elections when Democrats took back the House. Who got elected in 2018? On the one hand, AOC entered Congress in that election. Ayanna Pressley, a progressive from Massachusetts, entered Congress in that election. But so did Abigail Spanberger, who's now running for governor of Virginia. So did Mikey Sherrill, who's now running for governor of New Jersey. They are certainly seen as more moderate than, they're broadly progressive, they're center left, but they're seen as more moderate than AOC or Ayanna Pressley. But they were all united by these core commitments that we needed to expand health coverage, that we needed to act on climate change, that we needed to redress some of the inequality in our economy. And, I think one of the tragedies of the Biden term is that because of the way his term blew up at the end in that debate, and the fact that he looked sort of much weaker at the end than he did at the beginning. The real accomplishments of that administration are going to be lost. The, passing the IRA, misnamed IRA, that made extraordinary investments in clean energy, which is good for the economy and good for fighting climate change. The investments in technology that have created a lot of blue-collar jobs, often in Republican areas, and of course the big infrastructure bill. That and so many other things, some of them done administratively, were genuinely unifying between the moderate and progressive wings of the Democratic Party and of public opinion. And I think that at this moment, when democracy is under this kind of threat, we should have arguments with each other. Arguments are reasonable, but I think a deep split between the center left and the left, or middle of the road people and progressives, is something we cannot afford at this moment in our history. And that was the argument in 2020. And unfortunately, I wish it weren't as relevant again, but the return of Donald Trump in a much more aggressive form, I think, requires that kind of coalition building again.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritties of how to do that. And because there is, as we know, deep divisions within the Democratic Party as to which path to take following the defeat of Kamala Harris and the reascension of Donald Trump. So there was a circular firing squad that maybe is still firing, but perhaps running out of bullets, I don't know, where they were blaming each other, one for whatever missteps. Should Biden have dropped out earlier? Should she have answered Trump more forcefully on transgender issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering what you make, first of all, of the fact that this party still seems to be riven, even though they all agree that Donald Trump and this administration pose an unprecedented threat. Why can't they set aside their differences to present a united front?
I think, the story of the rabbi who says to one guy, you're right, and the other person says the opposite, and the rabbi says, and you're right, and they both say, but that can't be true, and then the rabbi says, that's right too. And I think we're in a situation where there are two things that are true at the same time. There is this argument, and it always happens after a defeat. And of course, almost all post-campaign criticism comes from people saying they should have done this, which of course is what the person would have said whether they had won or lost the election. That's on all sides of those discussions. There are legitimate arguments to be had. On the other hand, or as Stephen A. Smith says, however, I hope there are sports fans out there who got that reference. The fact is, if you looked, for example, at what happened on this big, ugly bill in Congress, there was absolute unity from the most conservative Democrats to the most progressive Democrats. There was not only unity on voting against it, but there was broad unity on the messaging about it. The costs of hitting Medicaid, the costs of hitting food stamps, of hitting SNAP, what it did to the deficit, and some of the other dangers of the bill. So in a way, the party is less divided than it sometimes looks. On the other hand, there are debates over what happened. And to me, I think there are basic things that happened that explain the defeat that aren't necessarily ideological. One was, unfortunately, President Biden started looking much older in that debate, only brought it home. And I think that Biden's personal popularity was lower than it might have been had Joe Biden had the sort of, his skill, energy, ability to present himself that he had even five years earlier. So that's a piece of it. And there were two big issues that were problematic. One were prices, and the other was the southern border. And I think that when you sort of go back and look, prices are actually coming down. Inflation was under control. But I think the failure to address the ongoing frustration with prices, which were also, I think, part of the long frustration of people, particularly in parts of the country that had been battered economically, with their own standard of living. I think prices and standard of living were kind of tied. And then the southern border, where the administration acted, but acted later than they should have. I think those more than anything else explain the defeat. There are arguments about where the party stands in social issues, although I've really been struck on the trans issue by something that I learned doing some reporting in my hometown. My hometown is a place called Fall River, Massachusetts. It's a factory town 50 miles south of Boston. It's very working class, quite Catholic. We have been an old labor democratic town forever. And I joke that we came for Al Smith and we stayed for FDR. For 100 years, Fall River voted Democratic for president in election after election after election. This election was the first time in 100 years that my hometown of Fall River voted Republican for president. They were 75% for Obama, for Kerry, for Gore. But not this time. And there was a steady deterioration. And I am persuaded that in a lot of communities like that have been shifting toward the Republicans under Trump, there is first deunionization, which, the loss of industrial jobs we talk about, but that also leads to deunionization, which I think fundamentally alters the political character of a place, but also a sense of frustration so deep that people are willing to take a gamble even on someone like Trump. But I went back and talked to people, and the most interesting perspective I got on the trans issue was from somebody who said, look, a lot of people here are socially conservative, they're uncomfortable with trans. But the real thing is, that ad by Trump ran so much that a lot of people thought that Kamala Harris was running her campaign on this. And this one person said, and I'm cleaning up the language here, why does she care so much about those people when my life is going down the drain? And I think it was as much about a sense of who the party cares for than it was, a total rejection of trans rights. And I think there are ways of defending the rights of trans people in ways that do not necessarily push everyone away. And I think an emphasis, and again, I think it's tragic for Harris that she ran a very careful campaign. That was not the centerpiece, but Trump drove that home in a way that I think very much distorted the nature of the campaign, but successfully so.
Yeah, and I think she was looking at polls that showed that people really didn't care that much about trans issues. They cared about pocketbook issues, and didn't answer the, she's for they, them, he's for you ad forcefully enough. I want to talk a bit about Zohran Mamdani in New York, because you mentioned that in your white working class hometown, people went for Trump for the first time, but a lot of people in Los Angeles and in New York who are not white and are younger also went for Trump for the first time. And in New York, many of them then voted also for Zohran Mamdani. And many analysts are saying and he himself is saying, it's because he went out to talk to them and listen to them and to take them seriously and try to address their direct needs and wants. And primarily those, again, were pocketbook issues. He has not been embraced by the Democratic Party at all. And leaders in the party nationwide have not necessarily congratulated him or supported him, with the exception, of course, of Bernie Sanders and AOC. Bernie Sanders, though, is an independent. So, in terms of uniting the party, when you look at Zoran Mamdani's win, and it was such a decisive win over an establishment Democrat, albeit a very tainted candidate in Andrew Cuomo, then what lessons do you draw from that in terms of perhaps uniting the two sides on a national level when you look at the fact that this candidate, a progressive, is so, I don't want to say like toxic to many members of the party?
So, first of all, if people who might be interested in what I think about that race, I actually wrote about a 4,000-word essay on the Brookings website about the Mamdani race. If you just Google me and Brookings and Mamdani, it should come up. I was transfixed by that race. And I have a daughter in her 20s who lives in New York. And I really got through her the sense, early on, the sense of excitement that this candidacy was creating. And I truly believe he is a generational talent. And if you look around the commentary afterward, even people who didn't like him, even people who supported Cuomo, talked about what a talent this person is. And he presented warm and friendly. He was angry on your behalf, but it wasn't an angry radicalism. In this piece I wrote, I noted that the best pundits about Mamdani's political career were in his middle school when they awarded him the Biggest Smile Award because there was a magnetic quality to the way he campaigned. But there was a second thing he did that I think applies to every kind of Democrat. We can talk about the issues with the Middle East and all of that, and that there's a whole separate set of concerns there that people have, and he's been trying to deal with. But one of his, he was a master of the new media, and one of his most powerful videos was when he went into the areas of New York City that Trump had carried, including Latino areas where Trump had gained ground on the last election, and asked people why they voted for Trump, and it was almost uniformly the cost of living. And like any good politician, he decided to campaign on the issue the voters cared about. Now, he tailored his program was a left of center program, tailored to the cost of living, thus free buses, free childcare, freeze the rent. That freeze the rent was so associated with him that when he spoke to crowds, he'd start freeze and the crowd would shout back rent. Again, you can debate all these things, but they were very concrete. They were very clearly directed to this concern. And Mamdani, talking about that video and that listening tour, said something that everybody in politics, on the progressive side, the center-left side, the moderate side, and I would say the other side, ought to listen to. He said we should listen more and lecture less. And that totally went against the stereotype of liberals who are always lecturing people about how they want them to be and how they're supposed to behave and what they're supposed to think. And he ran this, so he ran as a democratic socialist, he ran as a progressive, but he ran as someone who was talking to the electorate where it was. Now, we shouldn't overestimate one Democratic primary. On the one hand, the turnout was very good, and he mobilized exceptional turnout in voter registration among young people. The real spikes among voters under the age of 35 in that electorate. I don't think you can take his victory in a Democratic primary in New York City as predicting what's going to happen in Nebraska, New Jersey and Virginia, let alone Nebraska. But I think there are aspects of that campaign, I could go on a bit on that I think are relevant to everyone. Looking to the fall, I mentioned Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill. I think it's going to be very interesting to see. The Republicans are going to try to hang Mamdani, the radical, around everyone and every Democrat, and they'll deal with that the way they want. Although I think Mamdani is going to complicate that for them in the way he's running. But I think they too are going to become spokespeople for the party. And guess what? They're talking about prices too. They're talking about the cost of living. They're talking about how Trump's tariffs are affecting the cost of living, and his actions on healthcare are affecting the cost of living. So again, I think you may end up seeing very different people in one sense, but campaigns that are not as radically different than you might expect by the time we get around to November.
Well, also, New York has elected a Republican mayor not infrequently. So
20
Bloomberg,
years. I mean, you had Giuliani win twice, and
yeah,
although he was a nominal Republican, he was on the ballot as a Republican, Mike Bloomberg.
right.
I don't think the Republican candidate is strong, but Eric Adams is running for re-election, and Adams is going to go after Mamdani. But, the thing he will have going for him against Adams is the same thing he had going for him against Cuomo, which is a very unpopular opponent. When you looked at the polling in New York, one of the striking things is when Cuomo was way ahead, he was at 33% in February. Mamdani was at 1% at that point. In the end, in the first round of voting, which is what the polling was on, Cuomo got, if I remember right, 37%. So he gained 4 points in the whole campaign. And Cuomo's theory was, if I make it a Mamdani-me race, they'll vote against the radical because I'll be safe. I think that ended up having the opposite effect as was intended, which is it identified as Mamdani the candidate to vote for if you wanted to beat Cuomo. And so it was a very curious inversion. But we can't underestimate how much opposition to Cuomo there was in the city. And I don't think people factored that in when they were predicting an easy victory for him.
Right. I mean, as I said, a very flawed candidate who's basically, thrown out of office. And but I'm wondering though if there isn't a larger lesson here for the rest of the party in that the Democrats aren't popular nationwide. When you poll people, they don't like the Democrats about the same, maybe less than they like Trump. So is there a feeling of anti-party, anti-establishment that was tapped into very effectively by Mamdani that the rest of the party should be listening to, that offering the same kinds of policies that perhaps worked in the Clinton era is not going to fly this time, and that they need to at least they need to present themselves differently and as more as outsiders, as populists, as whatever it is, not beholden to the entrenched power elite. Do they need to campaign at least in the same vein, whether or not their policies are that different, but present themselves as a different kind of Democrat than, a Harris or a Clinton?
You know what's funny about your question, it's a good question, is sometimes when I was watching Mamdani, he actually reminded me of Bill Clinton, not necessarily Clinton ran as a populist. We forget that a large part of the content of the 92 campaign was a populist content. Yes, he was a New Democrat and all that, but he was a populist candidate, which Mamdani was, but also that sense of smiling hope. I was born in a place called Hope. I mean, I think, number one, Mamdani spoke to the party's desire for younger leadership. And I don't think there's any question that hunger extends across the party, and not just among young people who feel it most, but among older Democrats too. Second, Benjamin Wallace Wells had a really good piece on this in the New Yorker. New. People want new. Now, you might say people in America want new all the time, but I think at this moment, the frustration is deep enough that they want a sense of somebody providing a different path. And so I think the new is there. I think hopeful is central. And lastly, not to be afraid. And I think some of the frustration with Democrats is that they sometimes seem to be calculating too much. Look, Mamdani calculated too. He said he learned that prices were the big issue. So I don't think we should pretend that, anybody running for office is going to read polls and try to figure out how to win. But I think being visibly unafraid, being visibly here's who I am. I'm comfortable with who I am. I'm comfortable with the arguments I am making. I think that's part of the frustration. And yes, I think that reproducing the 90s is not what people want. I think, deregulation of the kind that happened in the 90s was discredited by the financial crash of 2008, and they turned around and sort of re-regulated to some degree. People are looking for clarity on what you stand for. And I think the other thing, and I think this is a Washington thing, that I work at a think tank, so I love policy. I think policy really matters. But I think that, and I think a method that was used both by Bernie and Mamdani is a method that can be used on behalf of a variety of policies, more or less progressive, but some more moderately so, which is make a few clear offers. I always thought the strength of Bernie's campaign came in part from, I'll give you free college and I'll give you universal, single-payer health care. I think you can debate the merits of single-payer health care, but put that aside, as opposed to other ways of getting everyone, ensuring everybody is the bottom line for me. But it was a clear promise. People got it. They could put it in their pocket. Same for free rent, free buses, free childcare, rent freeze. And I think, Brad Lander, who was an opponent of Mamdani, who embraced him in the end, it was a really good, would have made a good mayor. He was very progressive, but not in quite the same place as Mamdani was. But he had 100 proposals. He had a really rich program that no one knew about to the degree they knew about Mamdani. So I think there is a messaging lesson about be firm about certain things that you are offering the electorate. And I think he really mastered that.
Yeah. So now what should the Democrats be focused on? Because they had a strong one single idea to run on in 2018, and that was, the Dobbs decision. But now running on taking Medicaid away in 2 years, because that's going to happen after the midterms, for probably most midterm voters, Medicaid is not the salient issue. So what do you think that would be more of a salient issue for the midterm campaign?
Well, first of all, I think when you look at what happened in 2018, Obamacare, the repeal was very important. And while I agree with your premise that Medicaid isn't quite the target as the repeal of Obamacare was, remember, they failed to repeal it, and it still hurt them. I think within the Medicare SNAP and tax cuts for the very wealthy, there is a very strong argument that Trump has sold out all of the working class voters he claimed to represent. And I think, the kind of decline in the Democratic working class vote, as you pointed out, was not simply the white working class. There was also sharp decline in the Latino working class, and to some degree among younger Black men. And I think that gives them a real opportunity to say, that he is not for you. This is phony populism. This is plutocratic populism. And I think there are simple ways of making that clear. So I think that's important. I do think that a lot of Americans, and you've seen Trump's popularity go down, I think a lot of Americans are uneasy with the immigration plan. I think it's fascinating that in the polling, when you ask, do you approve or disapprove of Trump on the southern border, they approve because the border is quiet. If you ask, do you approve or disapprove of Trump on immigration, the numbers go negative. Why? Because they don't like this spectacle. They don't like sending people out of the country without having any rights at all. So I think, and especially in the Latino community, there's been some reporting lately that that surge that Trump enjoyed in the Latino community looks like it's ebbing. And so I think that's a second piece of it. And I think they're I think there were votes to be had there. I have been interested in and have some sympathy for, Ezra Klein's abundance argument. And I don't think it's a complete thing. And I think, it needs to be filled out and supplemented. And abundance is probably not as good a word as plenty or some simpler word. I love the word abundance, but that does strike me as a $25 word.
That's a lot.
That's right. But I do think the idea of a hopeful future for the country. I've been thinking a lot in new frontier terms. That's what I started thinking about when I read Abundance, where we have all this technological know-how. We have all this inventiveness in the United States. What we need is a government that is capable of building things that takes advantage of this rather than try to throw out talent that wants to come into the United States. And it is also very aware that a lot of people have been left out of abundance. And so this is abundance for everybody. As I say, I'm still trying to figure out the answer to your question, like a lot of people are. But I think, and even Mamdani embraced some of abundance in his campaign. And he talked about how if you are a progressive, you should be insistent that government works well because you are relying on government to make life better for people. And if government doesn't work, you are not keeping your core promise. So I think there's something there. And obviously I think Trump's tariffs also open up a lot of potential because he didn't keep his promise on prices. Midterms will be easier to win on, opposition. They're going to have to figure out an affirmative agenda for the 28 election. And I do think that, if you marry some of what Mamdani did with some of what the abundance folks have talked about, I think you might find a way to bring together this broad coalition that you need to get past 51%, hopefully do better than 51%.
Yeah. Well, just for people who don't know what the abundance agenda is, it's basically a critique of the Democrats and the Democratic Party, saying they're too caught up in their regulations to protect various interest groups, environmentalists, labor, et cetera, and they need to kind of cut through all that morass in order to actually build things like high-speed rail in California or more housing for low-income and homeless people, et cetera, et cetera. And
I think it's important that there is a kind of left version of abundance, which I think is important. I think the biggest question that the pro-abundance people have to answer to me is, it can't be a pure deregulatory agenda because we don't want to get rid of all environmental protections. We don't want to get rid of all labor protections for damn sure. We don't want to let a single person like Robert Moses in New York impose whatever the hell he wants on every community around. So the question is, they got to find the right balance. On the other hand, do you want projects delayed 4 or 5 years or forever? No. And so that is because I think one of the best critiques of abundance is that it sounds like a rationale for Trump's radical deregulatory agenda. And I do not sign on for that. I don't think anybody should sign on for that. On the other hand, the notion that we have made it way too hard to build things and that we need to find a way to speed up this process so that government can deliver to people and increase trust. I think that part of it is right. And you saw in the debate in California over the 2 bills passed recently, it's a hard debate. But they were trying to strike a balance in those bills.
They're carrying around copies of Abundance in Sacramento when they voted to get a big portion of CEQA, the environmental law. So it is obviously having an influence.
Yeah.
And let's get to some of the questions because, wow, time is just flying away. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Alan asks, why are progressives a better solution than moderates finding common ground with independence? For many Jews, progressives are pretty anti-Israel, and there is a growing anti-Semitism among progressives, making it hard for Jews to support the very progressive end of the Democratic Party.
I am so um, struck and think a lot about how horrible October 7th was and everything that came after. October 7th, the attack itself was it was an unconscionable, brutal, evil attack. Ironically, on some of the most peace-minded people in Israel, when you actually looked at who lived down there. And then what followed October 7th and the debate once the Gaza war started has been one of the most destructive debates in the history of the Democratic Party and the left. I am of a view that's probably shared by a lot of these people on this call, which is I believe in the importance of the survival of Israel as a Jewish homeland, and I am extremely critical of Bibi Netanyahu and of the conduct of the war and the failure to end the war much earlier negotiating for the hostages. That's sort of where I come from. I think that the Gaza war and the fact that for young people, the Israel they know has been almost entirely the Israel Bibi Netanyahu, has created a long-term problem for Israel's standing in American politics and has created enormous alienation among the young. And there's just a lot of work to do. I think it's going to be interesting to watch Lander and Mamdani try to manage this in New York. And, Lander is very enthusiastic about Mamdani. He's also a liberal Jew who supports the existence of the state of Israel and is critical of Netanyahu. I think how you bring back, and what happened in 24, the greatest irony for Democrats is they lost on both ends of this issue. They lost Muslim votes, particularly in Michigan, and they lost some Jewish votes on the other side. And it's been a real, and of course, Muslims and Jews both were strongly Democratic groups. So this is a real problem for the party. On the moderate and progressive, so I almost separate out the Middle East and that debate as something very particular, even though the questioner is not wrong to link them to some degree to moderate and progressive. No, one of the arguments in my book is that moderates are often right about an approach to politics that says you don't necessarily have to do everything now to make progress, that we build on things. The original Social Security bill wasn't nearly as good as the one that was Social Security that was created with the 1951 amendments. The original bill cut out Black people by cutting out certain jobs. It got through Congress, and that was a scandal. They needed to do it because of Southern committee chairs, but eventually that led to the program. The Obamacare was not as good when it started as it was when the amendments to it happened under Biden. So I think moderates who say that you can make steady progress are often correct. And I think a moderate disposition is just a good thing because I still think people prefer the swing voters are not crazy about yelling and anger entirely. But I think progressives are right in some of their diagnosis about fundamental unfairnesses in the society. And I think there are ways in which they each need each other. I think they need each other in electoral terms. And I think that moderates often need the pressure progressives bring. And progressives need the coalition building capacity that moderates bring. By proposing single payer, Bernie Sanders made Obamacare look more moderate. And that was actually probably helpful to the passage of Obamacare.
You mentioned how Mamdani is a singular political character, and that he's has a lot of talent politically. I'm wondering if who you think on a national stage is similar, who could run for president in 2028.
Oh, if they're ready to run for president, I am personally fascinated with both Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill as people whom I think are going to be maybe not ready for 2028, but I think at the end of this cycle, I am assuming they win. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so. But I think these are two very talented people who have a capacity to reach pretty broadly. So these are two people I'm fascinated by. I find Chris Murphy really interesting, and I think he is clearly running for president. I don't myself have a candidate yet. I don't think that person has been identified. If you're looking at lanes, Chris Murphy is clearly a very plausible on the progressive lane if Bernie doesn't run. And AOC will just barely be in time to be president. I don't think she'll run. She is a heck of a talent. I think on the sort of more moderate lane, I think Josh Shapiro is a very impressive politician. Mayor Pete's going to run. I still think of him as Mayor Pete. Buttigieg is going to run. He's an impressive politician. And then you have a whole slew of other people. You probably have 15 candidates. I think Ruben Gallego from Arizona is a very interesting character and has some real talent and potential. But I am not, I do not feel like I see any certain candidate. I'm curious. You're a politics watcher. I'm curious whom you see.
Well, what do you think of Gavin Newsom?
I wonder how, I guess the question, I had a long interview with him once where I actually found him a very appealing character because in the course of the interview, he had an absolutely wonderful sense of humor about himself, which I value in people. I think that he made a real mistake with those podcasts with those right-wingers early on. And I don't know how a governor of California will play in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, whether, how Newsom will play there. I think if he wants the nomination, he's got to show those are the kinds of places he can win. Kind of like John Kennedy had to show that a Catholic could win in West Virginia. I think he's got to show an appeal to the kind of working class Democrat that former Democrat they need to win back. But I must say, in my interview with him, I enjoyed him very much because I appreciated that sense of humor.
But that's what he's trying to do, this tacking to the center by putting these guys on his podcast, right? And it's interesting.
That didn't work. That wasn't the way. I didn't think that was the way to do it. These are pretty objectionable people, and you didn't need to put them on. It's not reaching out to them. It's reaching out to actual working class people. It's going to talk to the Trump voters. Not to these extreme, these extreme voices, Trump voters, and looking at groups, younger men, and some of the Latino vote. Yeah, take a look at the groups you lost, figure out what's going on, and talk to them. I don't think you needed to push those guys up. I'm very intrigued by Josh Friday running for lieutenant governor, whom I love his love of service, and his dedication to that over a long time, but not for president. Lieutenant governor, that's his thing now.
It's this line. Okay. Just changing the subject to something a little less positive, I guess. MJ and others have asked, do you think the voter suppression moves by the Republicans will make it impossible for Democrats to win elections? Many Democrats have lost confidence that there can be free and fair elections, given all the voter suppression efforts and gerrymandering by GOP and MAGA folks. Even James Carville is doubting that the midterms will be free and fair.
Worried about it. And I think the interesting thing is that you've got roughly 20 states under unified Democratic control. And I think it's going to be very hard to mess with them. But obviously not all this, so I don't think there'll be voter suppression in California or New York or New Jersey or Massachusetts and there are some seats to pick up in those states that they need to pick up. North Carolina is going to be a real test where they have been willing to mess around with the law. Now they finally, with that Supreme Court race where they really tried to literally throw out 60,000 ballot votes to take a Supreme Court seat, but they failed. That may put some limits on voter suppression in North Carolina. I've been worried about voter suppression for a long time, and having the White House and not having the Justice Department on the side of full voting rights is going to be challenging. So I think it is something people are going to have to worry about, spend a lot of time on. But I think it's particularly focusing in certain red states where where there are quite a few swing seats. I'm worried that the Republicans may do some gerrymandering pre-election in Texas and North Carolina, or elsewhere to pick up a seat or two here or there. So, yeah, I'm worried about this, but I think there are ways in which we may have a kind of bifurcated election. Certain states will have a fully participatory election, and others might not, and that's a problem.
Okay, we are out of time. Unfortunately, we just flew by that hour. Just, I don't know, just
What a joy to be with you. It's a real
fantastic.
joy. And I guess what I tell people, first of all, I am grateful for this group of people who take some time on tonight to do this. You only get the democracy you fight for. This is a moment when people cannot get discouraged and cannot withdraw. It's very frustrating. The news is very frustrating. But you don't win if you don't fight. And I think that there's everything to fight for. So don't give up, because giving up is accepting defeat, and we can't accept defeat in this circumstance. So thank you for being a group of people who aren't giving up.
Yes, don't move and leave the country. Stay. All right, EJ, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And
Real joy to be with you. Thank you.
okay.
Take care.
And for all of you, join us again next week with Max Boot in conversation with Warren Alney to talk about Russia's war on Ukraine, Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and the search for peace. And I will be back with you again shortly. Thanks, and have a great night.